They have bolted a padded leather collar around the man's throat and chained it to an iron hoop behind his skull, so his head sits trapped and held upright hour after hour until the muscles in his neck burn and there is nowhere to put the pain. His wrists are shackled to the arms of the chair, the skin gone raw where he has pulled against the irons. He simply sits, locked in place, while the day grinds past and no one frees him. He has broken no law. This is what they did to the people they called insane, and the men who did it called it medicine. He is one of 100,000. Across the country, the wards are packed with people committed on the word of 2 doctors and a relative, hosed down in cold water on arrival, stripped of their names and given a number, force-fed through a tube if they refused to eat, locked in padded cells if they screamed. A great many never came out. They rotted on the wards, coughed themselves to death on the tuberculosis breeding in the crowding, and were buried out the back under a marker with no name on it, only that number. Front gate to numbered grave. That is the road we are walking. Let me say a quick hello. I'm really glad you're here, and if you keep coming back, you already know what we get up to here. Do me one small favor while you're settling in. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, whatever the weather's doing outside your window right now, because I genuinely like seeing how far these stories reach. And to the people who help keep the channel going, thank you. You're the reason I get to spend time digging through old reports and burial registers. Right, let's get into it. Start with how easy it was to end up behind those walls in the first place, because that part surprises people. We tend to imagine some careful process, doctors conferring, courts weighing evidence, a chance to argue your case. For a great many people, none of that existed. A clerk dipped his pen, asked your name, and wrote a number beside it. And from that moment the name barely mattered. The number followed you down the corridor, onto the bath list, into the casebook, and eventually, if things went the way they went for most people who walked through those doors, onto a small iron marker in a field behind the wall. A relative's signature, a doctor or two who agreed, an entry in a register, no courtroom. No jury. Most of the people it happened to never got to say a word in their own defense before the doors closed. England and Wales ran on a system built around 2 pieces of paper. If you had money, or your family did, you were a private patient, and getting you committed required 2 medical certificates signed by qualified practitioners, plus an order from a relative or guardian. That's it. 2 doctors and a relative. The doctors didn't have to be specialists in anything resembling psychiatry. The law was loose enough that, as one historian of the period put it, the qualified medical man signing your certificate could incidentally be a pharmacist. Someone who, on another day, might be measuring out cough syrup, and the 2 doctors didn't even have to agree with each other in any meaningful sense, or examine you together, or spend much time at it. Each signed his own certificate, often after a brief interview. Sometimes after an interview the patient didn't even understand was an examination. The standard was a doctor's stated opinion that you were of unsound mind and a proper person to be confined, and an opinion is a flexible thing. A man predisposed to find madness, or paid in a way that nudged him toward finding it, or simply hurried and incurious, could form that opinion fast. The whole legal weight of removing a person's liberty came down to 2 signatures and a relative's order, 3 pieces of paper that between them could end a life as the person had known it, and the person at the center of it frequently had no idea any of it was happening until the men arrived to take them away. If you were poor, the route was different, but not exactly comforting. A pauper could be committed on the order of a justice of the peace together with a single medical certificate, a magistrate and 1 doctor, and once you were in, the older system gave you no appeal, none. You were simply there, behind the wall, and the question of whether you should be was now somebody else's to answer, on their own schedule, if they bothered to answer it at all. It helps to understand that there wasn't one kind of asylum, there were 3, and which one swallowed you depended almost entirely on your bank balance. At the top, in a manner of speaking, sat the private madhouses, run for profit, and the people who ran them were running a business. Historians of the period have a name for the whole enterprise. They call it the trade in lunacy, and it was a genuinely good trade. Even into the 20th century, a royal commission found that some proprietors of these private houses had been earning over £2,000 a year. That is an enormous sum for the time, and every penny of it came from keeping beds full. Now sit with that for a second. The man deciding whether you were well enough to leave was the same man whose income depended on you staying. Below the private houses sat the charitable and voluntary hospitals, places like Bethlehem and the York Retreat, funded by subscription and endowment. And then, after 1845, the great mass of it, the county pauper asylums, the enormous public buildings that ended up holding the overwhelming majority of the country's confined. The financial incentive at the private end made for some ugly arithmetic. A family locked in a dispute over an inheritance, over property, over a will, could go shopping for a sympathetic physician, find one willing to sign, and have an inconvenient relative declared unsound and tucked away. The law as written did almost nothing to stop it. Wilkie Collins wasn't inventing a nightmare for his readers. He was dramatizing a loophole that everyone with money already understood. And the incentive ran in one direction once you were inside too. A private patient was income, a steady payment arriving as long as the bed stayed occupied, so the proprietor of a profitable house had a quiet financial reason to find you not quite well enough to leave, year after year. Nobody had to be a cartoon villain about it. A doctor can always find grounds for caution, always point to some lingering symptom, some risk of relapse, some reason it would be premature to send you home. And when caution happens to coincide with the doctor's own income, caution tends to win. The system had built a conflict of interest into its very foundations and then trusted the individuals inside it to ignore the conflict, and that is a great deal to ask of anyone running a business. Some proprietors were honest, some were not, and the patient on the wrong side of the locked door had almost no way of telling which kind they'd been handed to. The diagnoses themselves give you a sense of how wide the net was. A person could be certified for mania, for melancholia, which we'd recognize today as severe depression, for monomania, an obsession with a single fixed idea, for dementia, for what they bluntly called idiocy. General paralysis of the insane sat on the list too, and we'll come back to it, because it killed more people inside these walls than almost anything else. Puerperal insanity was there, the breakdown that could follow childbirth. And there was a category that tells you everything about the moral climate of the age: masturbatory insanity, the genuine medical belief that self-abuse could rot the mind. People were committed, examined, and recorded under that heading in case books in serious clinical handwriting, as though it were as established as a broken arm. What unites a lot of these categories is how much room they left for judgment, and how little a patient could do to argue with them. A broken arm is a broken arm. Either the bone is snapped or it isn't, and you can see it on the person. Monomania, moral insanity, hysteria, masturbatory insanity. These were diagnoses built almost entirely out of the doctor's interpretation of how a person behaved, and behavior can always be read more than one way. The woman who wept too much was melancholic. The woman who laughed too much was manic. The man with a fixed idea the doctor disagreed with had monomania. The boy whose private habits his parents disapproved of had a disease of the brain. Once a practitioner had decided which box you belonged in, almost anything you did could be folded in as further proof: your protests as agitation, your calm as cunning, your anger as confirmation of the very instability you were trying to deny. The looseness of the categories was no secret to the Victorians who used them. It was simply the state of the science, a medicine of the mind that had powerful institutions and almost no reliable tests, and a great many people fell into the gap between the two. All of this sat on top of a framework that the Victorians were actually rather proud of. In 1845, Parliament passed two laws together, the Lunacy Act and the County Asylums Act, and the second one made it compulsory for every county to build an asylum for its pauper lunatics. The first one created a national body of inspectors called the Commissioners in Lunacy, 11 men who were supposed to keep an eye on the whole apparatus and make sure the people locked inside were being treated decently. The man who chaired that body for 40 years, from its founding until his death in 1885, was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, better known to most people as a great reformer, the man behind the Factory Acts and the campaigns against child labour. He took the work seriously. He visited asylums himself, and he spent 4 decades watching a system he helped build slowly outgrow every good intention he'd had for it. The reformers genuinely believed they were fixing something monstrous, and James Norris was the monster they had in mind. The man who found him was a Quaker land agent named Edward Wakefield, who forced his way into Bethlehem in 1814 with a publisher, an architect, and a couple of members of Parliament in tow. Norris wasn't the only thing they found. In another cold cell sat a woman named Anna Stone, naked, filthy, chained. But it was Norris, bolted to his bar with the iron ring around his neck and the iron band crushing his arms to his sides, who became the image that would not leave people alone. Wakefield wrote down exactly what he saw, in plain detail, and the apothecary in charge of Bethlehem, a man named John Haslam, had a tidy answer ready for it. He called Norris the most malignant and the most mischievous lunatic he ever saw in his life. That was the defense. He was difficult, so they bolted him to the masonry for a decade. An artist came and sketched him in June of 1814, and the engraving went everywhere. Norris was finally released from the irons that same year. He didn't get to enjoy his freedom. His body was wrecked, and he died within weeks of consumption, the disease eating his lungs while he'd been chained up, unable to do anything about it. A decade in irons, freed at last, and dead inside a month, his lungs giving out before he could draw a free breath worth the name. The scandal forced a parliamentary inquiry in 1815. Haslam and the visiting physician Thomas Monro both lost their posts, and it fed into a slow, halting movement towards something better. That movement is the world the Victorians inherited, and the world they thought they were improving on. So when you hear that asylums were built as reforms, that's true. The bar Norris was chained to was the thing they were reforming away from. Hold on to that image, because the story of the Victorian Asylum is partly the story of how the chains came off, and then, when the buildings filled past breaking, how some of them quietly went back on. Monro is worth a half sentence more, because his story shows how entrenched the old way was. He wasn't some isolated bad apple. He was the latest in a line of Monros who had run Bethlem's medical side for the better part of a century, father to son, a small dynasty of physicians presiding over the chains and the cells, the position handed down almost like a family business. When the inquiry pressed him on what he actually did for his patients, his answers revealed a man who had largely stopped thinking of treatment as the point at all. The bleeding, the purging, the chaining, done by rote, in season, because that was what had always been done. That was the establishment the reformers were pushing against, not active cruelty, so much as a deep, comfortable, inherited indifference. A way of running a madhouse that had calcified over generations into something nobody inside it questioned until a Quaker land agent walked in and started writing things down. Now, the loose certification system had a consequence that the sensation novelists of the era absolutely feasted on. If 2 doctors and a relative could put you away, then the asylum became a tool, a weapon in the wrong hands. Wilkie Collins built The Woman in White around exactly this fear, the terror of a sane person, usually a woman, being declared mad and locked up so somebody else could get at her money or her freedom. And it wasn't pure fiction. Real cases kept surfacing that were almost too on the nose. The reading public ate it up because the fear was real and they knew it. Collins's novel sold enormously, and a few years later, Charles Reade published Hard Cash, built on the same nightmare, a sane man bundled into a private asylum to keep him quiet. And Reade put into his hero's mouth a cry of pure horror at the word asylum itself. These weren't writers inventing a danger to thrill their readers. They were dramatizing a hole in the law that every middle-class reader could feel the draft from, because every middle-class reader had property, or expectations, or an inconvenient relative, or could imagine becoming one. The novels worked as horror precisely because the machinery they described was real. Sitting there in the statute book, 2 certificates and an order, waiting to be misused by anyone with a motive and access to a couple of cooperative doctors. Take Georgina Weldon. In 1878, her estranged husband, Harry, decided he wanted her out of the way. She was eccentric, certainly. She was deep into spiritualism. She ran a musical orphanage. She was loud and difficult and entirely herself. Harry wanted to pursue another woman and stop paying Georgina's allowance, and the cleanest solution available to a Victorian husband was to have his wife certified insane. So 2 doctors came to see her. They didn't announce themselves as doctors assessing her sanity. They pretended to be interested in her orphanage, in her music, charming visitors making polite conversation, and on the strength of that visit, they signed the lunacy order. The plan was to have asylum staff arrive and physically take her away. She got wind of it and ran. For the 7 days that the order remained legally valid, Georgina Weldon stayed one step ahead of the people trying to seize her, and when the week ran out and the order expired, she marched straight to Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Here's the part that tells you how the law actually worked. As a married woman, she couldn't even sue her own husband, not until the Married Women's Property Act came through in 1882. The instant she could, she did. Between 1883 and 1888, she sued everyone involved, and she did it herself, representing her own case in court, at one point juggling 17 separate lawsuits at the same time. The papers started calling her the Portia of the law courts. She turned the thing that was meant to erase her into a public career. Her case did more than make her famous. It frightened the public. The idea that a respectable wife could be carted off on the word of 2 men who had lied their way into her parlor was exactly the nightmare the sensation novels had been peddling. And now here it was in the newspapers, with a real name attached. The pressure built, and in 1890 Parliament passed a new Lunacy Act, the consolidating one that tightened the whole system, added rights of appeal, and started choking off the licensing of the private madhouses that had made the trade in lunacy so profitable. Historians of the law are fairly direct about the cause. The Weldon affair, among others, drove the public to demand safeguards, and the politicians delivered them. One difficult woman with 17 simultaneous lawsuits did more to reform the lunacy laws than a great many sober committees had managed in the decades before her. Not everyone had Georgina Weldon's nerve or her stamina. Louisa Lowe was a vicar's wife, and her interest in spiritualism became the lever used to put her away around 1870. She spent over a year locked up, convinced the whole time that her husband was really after her property. When she got out, she didn't go quietly. She founded the Lunacy Law Reform Association and wrote a book with a title that leaves no doubt about how she felt. The Bastilles of England, the lunacy laws at work. She'd been inside one of those Bastilles, and she wanted everyone to know what it was like. The spiritualism is worth a note, because it shows how a perfectly ordinary Victorian enthusiasm could be turned into evidence of madness when someone wanted it to be. Spiritualism was everywhere in the second half of the century. Seances and mediums and table rapping, respectable people across the country dabbling in contact with the dead. It was a fashion, not a symptom. But for a woman whose husband wanted her out of the way, an interest in spiritualism was a gift, because it could be presented to a couple of doctors as delusion, as a mind unmoored from reality, as exactly the sort of thing that justified a certificate. Georgina Weldon's spiritualism was used against her the same way. 2 women, both interested in something thousands of their contemporaries were interested in, both nearly buried alive in the asylum system for it, because the interest gave a motivated husband and a compliant doctor the raw material they needed. Lowe came out and turned her year inside into a campaign, naming the asylums for what she'd found them to be, the Bastilles, the prisons that called themselves hospitals. These weren't isolated cranks. An organization existed, founded in 1845, the same year as the Great Reforming Acts, called the Alleged Lunatics' Friends Society. It was started by people who had themselves been confined, and its purpose was stated plainly in its founding resolution: the protection of the British subject from unjust confinement on the grounds of mental derangement. One of its founders was John Thomas Percival, and his story is worth pausing on because he left a record of the inside that few others did. Percival was the son of a prime minister. His father, Spencer Percival, holds the grim distinction of being the only British prime minister ever assassinated, shot in the lobby of the House of Commons in 1812 when John was a boy. John grew up, had some kind of religious and mental crisis, and from 1830 to 1832 he was confined, first at a private asylum near Bristol and then at another in Sussex. He came out the other side and did something unusual for the time. He wrote it all down in detail and published it. He described being treated as if he had no mind at all, spoken about in his presence as though he weren't there, handled like an object. Later, he called himself the Attorney General of Her Majesty's Madmen, and he spent years showing up to other people's cases, helping the confined fight their way back out. He'd been inside. He knew exactly how the doors worked. The society he helped run is recognized now as one of the earliest ancestors of what we'd today call a patient advocacy or survivors movement. Former patients organizing to protect the next person from what had been done to them. The founding membership reads like a small roll call of men who'd been through the machine and come out the other side angry and articulate. Men with names like Richard Paternoster and Louis Phillips and Captain Richard Saumarez. They campaigned, they published, they turned up at hearings. And the very fact that they had to do this, that the only reliable defenders of the confined were the formerly confined, tells you how little anyone else was watching the door. The vulnerability ran deepest for women, and the diagnoses tell you why. A woman could be committed for melancholia, for mania, for something called moral insanity, for hysteria, which was such a baggy term it could cover nervous anxiety at one end and sexual behavior the doctors disapproved of at the other. Nymphomania sat on the books as a clinical category. So did puerperal insanity, the breakdown some women suffered after childbirth, which was real and serious and is recognizable today, but which in that era could land a new mother in an asylum with no clear path home. Asylum records from the period show doctors who, in the words of one study, confused insanity with immorality, especially sexual immorality. A woman who didn't behave the way a wife or daughter was supposed to behave could find that misbehavior reclassified as madness, and madness had a building waiting for it. Puerperal insanity is worth slowing down on because it sat right at the cruel intersection of real suffering and social convenience. Some women genuinely did suffer severe mental breakdowns after giving birth, the sort of thing we'd now recognize as postpartum psychosis or severe depression, frightening and dangerous and entirely real. The asylum records describe these women as noisy, restless, incoherent, unable to care for themselves or their newborns. That part was medicine doing its imperfect best with a condition it didn't understand. But the diagnosis also caught women whose only real problem was that they'd become inconvenient at exactly the moment a household was least able to absorb the disruption. A new baby, an exhausted or overwhelmed mother, a husband who needed the home to keep running, and a medical category that could explain her away. At asylums up and down the country, puerperal insanity was one of the most common reasons for a woman's admission, and the records rarely tell you which of the two stories any individual case really was. The woman herself, frightened and postpartum, and now locked in a strange institution among strangers, often had no way to tell anyone the difference either. The deeper trap was that the very conditions of the asylum could keep a recoverable woman from recovering. A new mother in genuine post-birth crisis needs rest, support, and time, and might well have come through it at home with help. Drop her instead into a crowded ward full of chronically ill strangers, separate her from her infant entirely, surround her with the noise and routine and fear of the place, and you've removed every condition that might have healed her. Some women did recover and go home. Others didn't and stayed, the temporary crisis hardening into a permanent residency, the door that had been meant to be a brief stop becoming, quietly, the rest of their lives. Across the Atlantic, the same logic ran even more nakedly. Elizabeth Packard lived in Illinois, married to a Calvinist minister named Theophilus Packard, and in 1860 she made the mistake of disagreeing with him about religion openly in front of his congregation. Illinois at that time had a law on the books allowing a husband to commit his wife without the evidence of insanity that would be required for anyone else. Think about that. A legal carve-out existed specifically for wives. Theophilus used it. He had her examined by two doctors, both members of his own church, and they pronounced her insane after feeling her pulse. That was the medical examination. A hand on the wrist. To get to her in the first place, Theophilus had climbed through her locked bedroom window with an axe. She was carried out of her home and shipped to the state asylum at Jacksonville, where she stayed 3 years. When she finally got a jury trial in 1864, 12 men listened to the case and declared her sane in 7 minutes. 7 minutes to undo what 3 years of her life had been spent inside. She came out and turned herself into a force, founding an anti-asylum society, lobbying legislatures, and helping push through a personal liberty law in Illinois so the next woman couldn't be disappeared as easily as she nearly was. Her own account of her removal survives, and the detail that stays with you is the crowd. She wrote that men carried her from her house to the train in their arms, in front of a large, silent crowd of citizens who had gathered, some of them hoping to rescue her, none of them quite able to. A neighbor said afterward that he'd swear under oath she had been kidnapped. The law called it a commitment. The 7 minutes are worth dwelling on against the 3 years. A jury of ordinary men, given the actual facts, given the chance to listen to her speak and judge for themselves, needed only a few minutes to see what her husband and his 2 pulse-feeling doctors had refused to see, that there was nothing wrong with her mind at all. The whole apparatus that had taken 3 years of her life, the law, the doctors, the asylum, the certificates, collapsed in the time it takes to boil an egg the moment it was put in front of people with no stake in the outcome. And that gap, between how fast a fair hearing exposed the truth and how long the unfair system had run unchecked, is the indictment. Elizabeth Packard didn't get free because the system corrected itself. She got free because she fought her way to a courtroom the system hadn't been required to give her, and then spent the rest of her life trying to make sure the next woman got the courtroom first, before the 3 years, not after. The law that bore the cost of her 3 years was changed because she refused to let those years mean nothing. That word, commitment, brings us to the part that doesn't get described much because the people experiencing it rarely got to write about it: the journey. However you arrived at the diagnosis, somebody then had to physically take you to the building, and that trip was its own kind of horror, quieter than the chains but in some ways worse, because it was the moment the door of your old life actually closed. For most patients, the people doing the taking were not strangers. They were relatives, husbands, parents, sometimes grown children, occasionally a parish official or a policeman, but very often the very people you trusted most. Elizabeth Packard's account again gives us the texture of it, because hers is one of the few written from the inside of the cart. 2 strong men, hired by her husband for the purpose, carried her bodily. She didn't walk to her own committal. She was carried like furniture being moved past her neighbors onto the train. She wrote about the crowd that gathered, and it's a detail that says more than pages of argument could. The townspeople had come out, a large number of them, and they stood there mostly silent, some of them hoping to rescue her, none quite willing to lay hands on the sheriff and the hired men to do it. They watched a woman they knew be carried out of her own home and loaded onto the cars, and they understood that something was wrong, and they did nothing, because the men doing it had the law on their side. A neighbor said afterward he'd swear under oath she had been kidnapped. That was the word an ordinary person reached for. Kidnapped. The law had a different word, commitment, and the law's word was the one that counted. Packard sat among that silent crowd, perfectly lucid, watching her own removal happen with the full cooperation of every official involved. And she had 3 years ahead of her before a jury would take 7 minutes to agree she'd never been mad at all. The journey didn't end at the train. At the far side waited the asylum, and the moment of handover, the relatives or the officials signing the papers and stepping back, the doors of the institution taking custody. For Packard, it was the Jacksonville Asylum in Illinois. For an English pauper, it might be the great county building out among the fields. The specifics varied. The shape of the moment did not. You arrived as a person with a life, a home, a family, possibly a profession, and within an hour or 2 you were a patient. Your clothes gone, your name turned into an entry, the people who'd brought you already on their way back to the world you'd just been removed from. The transport itself depended on when and where you lived. Earlier in the century, it meant a cart or a carriage, often a long, jolting ride over bad roads, sometimes restrained the whole way if the family feared a struggle. As the railways spread, asylums started arriving by train, and in America there's a genuinely grim detail attached to this. The restraint device they used at the Utica Asylum, a sort of locking box we'll come to later, was sometimes used for transport. Difficult patients could be loaded into these boxes, the boxes loaded into a railway boxcar, and the whole cargo shipped to the station nearest the asylum, where wagons were waiting to carry them the last stretch. A person delivered like freight, in a box, by rail. Distance was its own punishment. The county asylums were big, regional buildings, often deliberately set out in the countryside away from towns, on the theory that fresh air and quiet were part of the cure. For the patient, it meant being driven steadily further from everything familiar, the streets you knew giving way to fields, the noise of home thinning out to birdsong and cartwheels, the family member beside you saying less and less the closer you got. Some patients had no real idea where they were being taken until they arrived. Others knew exactly, and that knowing was worse. Pauper patients were frequently delivered by the relieving officer, the local poor law official, a man who did this regularly, who had a route and a paper to sign, for whom your removal was a Tuesday, and then you'd see it, the building. The Victorians did not build their asylums to be reassuring. They built them to be enormous, and the size was partly the point. Colney Hatch, in Middlesex, opened in 1851, and its front alone ran nearly 1,900 feet, covering 14 acres, with something like 6 miles of corridor inside. When it opened, it was the largest asylum in Europe. Coming up the drive toward a frontage like that, already certified, already stripped of the right to refuse, knowing the relatives beside you were going to get back in the cart and you were not, that was the moment a lot of people understood for the first time that this was real and that it might be permanent. Through the gates, and the machinery of admission took over. This was the day the person you'd been was filed away. The intake followed a pattern that varied in its cruelty from one institution to the next, but rarely varied in its purpose, which was to convert an individual into an inmate. The paperwork came first, or close to it. Your name, your age, your parish, your supposed form of insanity, the date, the certificates that had put you there, all of it entered into the admission register that the 1845 Act required every asylum to keep. The register was a legal object, recording each patient's arrival and, in its final column, the discharge or the death. A casebook was opened for you, a clinical file that the medical staff would add to over the months and years, noting your behavior, your appetite, your delusions, your decline, or your recovery. For many patients, that casebook is now the only surviving trace of their existence, a few lines of a doctor's handwriting standing in for a whole human life. You read them, and you realize how thin the record is. A name, a diagnosis, a scatter of observations, a final date. That was the sum of what the system kept. It usually started with a bath, and the bath was an early shock for a reason. Nellie Bly, the American journalist who got herself committed to the asylum on Blackwell's Island in 1887 specifically to expose it, left a description that's hard to shake. She wrote that without warning she got bucket after bucket of water over her head, ice-cold water, into her eyes and ears and nose and mouth, her teeth chattering, her limbs gone blue and goose-fleshed with the cold. And that was the official bathing of patients. The water, she noted, was rarely changed. Many patients went into the same filthy water one after another, and the towels were shared even with patients who had open sores. A young law student confined at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum described being thrashed with a walking stick and then dragged off one morning, pitched head first into a bath and held down. The bath was where you learned the rules. You did not have a body that belonged to you anymore. Bly's whole account is worth knowing because she went in deliberately and came out able to write it all down, which almost none of the real patients could do. She'd feigned insanity to get committed, expecting to find it hard to keep up the act. Instead, she found that once the doctors had decided she was mad, nothing she did could change their minds. The saner she behaved, the more it was read as cunning or as the deceptive calm of the truly disturbed. She realized with mounting horror that she had walked into a place that was very easy to enter and nearly impossible to argue your way out of, where the staff had already decided what you were and would interpret everything you did to fit. Her exposé caused a sensation when it was published and led to real reforms in New York. But the thing she'd discovered was the same thing John Percival had discovered decades earlier on the other side of the Atlantic. Once the door closed and the label was attached, your own testimony about your own mind counted for almost nothing. After the bath, your own clothes were taken. You were issued the institution's uniform. Your details went into the admission register, a legal requirement under the 1845 Act, recording the date, the certificates, your particulars, and eventually the date of your discharge or your death, whichever came. A casebook entry was started, a physical examination was done, and then you were classified, sorted into a ward by your category. Pauper or private, acute or chronic, quiet or violent. The reformers had good reasons for the sorting, separating the frightened from the frightening, keeping the recently arrived away from the long-term residents. But the effect on the individual was the same. You became a type, a row in a ledger, a face in a category. The uniform deserves a moment because of how completely it worked. A person arriving in their own clothes carries their whole life on their back. Their station, their trade, their taste, the small choices that say who they are. Strip that off, hand them the standard asylum dress, the same coarse cloth as everyone on the ward, and you've performed a kind of erasure that no register entry could manage on its own. From across a day room, the bank clerk and the labourer and the farmer's wife now looked like one undifferentiated mass of patients. That was, in part, the point. The institution ran more smoothly when the people in it were interchangeable, and for some patients the loss of their own clothing was remembered decades later as the precise moment they stopped being a citizen and became a case. And at one asylum, you became a photograph. At the Surrey County Asylum, the superintendent of the female side from 1848 to 1858 was a man named Hugh Welch Diamond, and he was a keen early photographer. Diamond believed in physiognomy, the idea that the face was a readable map of the soul, that you could photograph a melancholic or a maniac and capture the visible signature of their particular madness. So he sat his female patients against a curtained wall and photographed them, one after another, building a catalogue of types. He worked in the wet collodion process, the cutting edge of the technology in the 1850s, and in May of 1856 he stood up before the Royal Society of Medicine and read a paper on applying photography to the physiognomy of insanity. He described the photographer's power in almost poetic terms, catching in a moment the permanent cloud or the passing storm or sunshine of the soul. Lovely phrase. The women in those pictures had no say in any of it. Surrey was a public institution, and the pauper patients there had no right to privacy whatsoever. The proof of what that meant comes later in Diamond's own career, when he left and set up a private asylum at Twickenham for paying patients. He was not allowed to photograph them. The wealthy could refuse. The poor could not. Same doctor, same camera, two completely different sets of rights, decided entirely by who was paying the bills. Diamond hadn't invented this way of looking at the mad. He'd taken over the female department from Sir Alexander Morrison, who'd published a book in 1838 called The Physiognomy of Mental Diseases, full of drawn faces meant to teach the reader to recognize insanity by sight. Photography just made the project faster and, in its way, crueler, because a drawing is an artist's interpretation and a photograph claims to be the plain truth. Those women weren't being treated when they sat for Diamond. They were being collected. Their faces became evidence in an argument about the nature of madness, an argument they had no part in and no power to refuse. You can still look at some of those Surrey portraits today. They're considered some of the earliest psychiatric photographs in existence. Women in plain dress, staring at or past the lens, and we know almost nothing about most of them beyond what Diamond wrote in his notes. A diagnosis, sometimes a number. The face survived. The person mostly didn't. It's a strange thing to look at them now, across more than a century and a half. The technology was new enough that holding still for the exposure was its own small ordeal, so the faces have that fixed, slightly braced quality of all early photographs, and you find yourself searching them for the madness Diamond was so sure the camera would reveal. Mostly you don't find it. You find tired women, frightened women, blank women, women who look like anyone might look, after being bathed in cold water, stripped of their clothes, sorted into a ward, and sat down in front of a stranger's apparatus. Whatever was actually wrong with their minds, and for some of them something surely was, the photograph doesn't show it. It shows a person in an institution, posed, captured, catalogued, and then mostly lost to the record except for this one held instant. Diamond thought he was building a science. What he actually left us is a row of faces with almost no names attached, which turns out to be the most honest portrait of the whole system he could possibly have made. Once you were bathed, dressed, registered, sorted, and in some cases photographed, you joined the ward and the rhythm of asylum life closed over you. To be fair to the people who designed these places, the rhythm was meant to be the cure. This is where the whole hopeful theory of the asylum lived, an idea called moral treatment, and it came from a genuinely decent impulse. It started with a death. In 1790, a Quaker woman named Hannah Mills died in the York Asylum, and when fellow Quakers tried to visit her in her final illness, they were turned away, and what they glimpsed of the conditions horrified them. Inmates chained up in what amounted to stables. A York tea and coffee merchant named William Tuke heard about it and decided his own community could do better. He proposed building a place for Quakers in mental distress, and in 1796 the York Retreat opened its doors. No chains, no manacles, Physical punishment banned outright. Patients given their own rooms, airy corridors, decent food, gentle routine, and useful work to occupy their hands and minds. The idea was that you treated a disordered mind by surrounding it with order, calm, and kindness, and that many people, given that, would find their way back. Tuke's grandson Samuel later wrote the book that spread the term moral treatment across the country, and the Tuke family stayed central to British psychiatry for generations. The Retreat is worth dwelling on because it shows the dream at its purest, before the numbers crushed it. Tuke had no medical training. He was a businessman and a man of faith, and he approached the problem as a moral one rather than a clinical one. He thought the mad were people to be coaxed, gently, back toward reason, rather than animals to be subdued, and that fear and force only made things worse. Where other places relied on the whip and the chain, the Retreat relied on routine, occupation, and the quiet pressure of being treated like a person who was expected to behave like one. Patients walked in the gardens, they worked, they sat down to proper meals, and the Retreat's recovery rates, by the standards of the time, were good enough to embarrass the chained-up establishments around it. The Tuke name ran down through the century, son to grandson to great-grandson, Samuel and then Daniel Hack Tuke, who co-wrote one of the era's standard psychiatric textbooks, the family staying close to the cause for 3 generations. When the county asylums went up after 1845, this was the dream they were chasing. Treatment through routine and labor, and in the well-run places, especially early on, it could look almost humane. The West Riding Asylum at Wakefield ran like a self-contained village, with its own dairy, butchery, bakery, garden, farm, and laundry. Patients worked the land, worked the workshops, did the sewing and the cleaning, and the theory said the work itself was healing. An early superintendent named William Ellis, who ran Wakefield and then went on to run Hanwell, talked about staff and patients as a kind of family and rewarded completed work with little comforts, tobacco, tea. The day itself was built on the clock. You were woken early, the wards roused at a fixed hour, beds made, faces washed, everyone moved through the same steps in the same order. Breakfast, then work for those well enough to do it, the men out to the farm and the gardens and the workshops, the women into the laundry and the sewing room and the kitchens, hour after hour of it. Meals at set times. An afternoon in the airing court, a walled outdoor yard where patients could take the air without any chance of wandering off. Then the evening, supper, prayers in many places, and the wards locked down for the night. The regularity was supposed to be the medicine. For a person whose mind was in genuine chaos, there's an argument that the predictability helped, that knowing exactly what came next was its own small comfort. For a person who was bored or sane or simply tired of it, the same routine became a kind of slow grinding, the same gallery, the same yard, the same faces, the same hours, repeating until the years lost their edges. At the better institutions, the diet was decent, sometimes surprisingly so. A generous diet was one of the most commonly prescribed treatments, and at some asylums, ale was a regular drink. An American who toured Wakefield came away impressed, noting that the patients had Sunday clothes distinct from their weekday working clothes, that beer was served regularly, and that there were concerts, balls, picnic excursions, all sorts of indulgences freely given. Dances were held. Magic lantern shows, the Victorian version of a slideshow projected on a wall in the dark, cricket on the asylum grounds, brass bands, libraries. A patient at Broadmoor named Matthew Jackson Hunter wrote to his sister in 1883, describing a well-stocked library, a cricket club, billiards, cards, and a good brass band that played selections of music every Monday evening through the summer on the terrace opposite the chapel. He said the officials treated them with kindness. That letter exists. Some people inside these walls had stretches of something close to peace. But Matthew Hunter at Broadmoor was, in the scheme of things, one of the lucky ones, and the gap between his Monday evening brass band and the daily reality of the average pauper ward was enormous. Because for the long-term, chronic, unwanted majority, moral treatment in practice meant regimented boredom. The same gloomy galleries, the same airing courts, the same hours spent doing nothing in particular under the eyes of an attendant. A medical report on Wakefield, written decades later but describing wards that hadn't changed much, talked about the gloomy and depressing galleries where patients aimlessly spent so much of their time. Aimlessly. Day after day after day. The day room is the image that sticks with me from the records. A long room, benches around the walls, a fire at one end if you were lucky, and patients sitting in it, hour after hour, with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Some rocking, some muttering, some simply staring. The recovered and the hopeless and the merely warehoused all in the same room, the air heavy with the smell of too many unwashed bodies and inadequate plumbing, the noise a constant low background of distress that you either learned to stop hearing or didn't. The recreations were real, the dances and the magic lantern shows and the cricket and the brass band, but they were occasional, a few bright hours stitched across great grey expanses of nothing. And the recreations tended to favour the patients who were already doing better, the ones well enough to dance or play or sit still through a concert, the patients sunk deepest in their illness, the one who needed something most, was often the one left in the day room while the others went out to the terrace to hear the band. The food, away from the showcase institutions, was often miserable. Nellie Bly on Blackwell's Island ate gruel broth, spoiled beef and bread that was barely more than dried dough, and drank dirty, undrinkable water. The contrast with the beer and Sunday clothes at Wakefield says it all, the whole truth of the system held in one comparison. Some asylums were genuinely trying, others were warehouses where you were fed the cheapest thing that would keep you breathing. Food mattered more than it might seem, because for a patient with little else, the meals were the structure of the day and one of the only pleasures available. A decent diet, served properly, was treated by the better superintendents as actual treatment, on the sensible theory that a body that's been fed and warmed has a better chance of a mind that settles. The American visitor who toured Wakefield kept coming back to the food and drink in his notes, the beer with meals, the distinction between weekday and Sunday clothes, the picnics and the concerts, because he understood he was looking at an institution that thought comfort was part of the cure. And then you set that beside Bly's spoiled beef and her dried dough and her undrinkable water. And you see the other half of the system, the half where comfort was a cost to be minimized and the patients were mouths to be filled as cheaply as the law and decency would allow. Same era, same stated purpose, two completely different experiences of being a human being inside the walls, and the thing that decided which one you got was, as ever, mostly money. The people who actually ran your daily life were the attendants, the keepers, and they were the weak point in the whole humane theory. They were poorly paid, often poorly trained, working long hours with too many patients, and the quality of your day depended enormously on whether the particular attendant in charge of your ward was kind or cruel or simply exhausted. At Hanwell, at the very end of the century, one attendant, a woman named Annie Alsop, had 80 patients under her care, with 7 staff beneath her to manage them all. 80 people. The medical superintendent sat at the top of this structure like a small king, with near total authority over the institution, but he wasn't the one who got you out of bed, fed you, washed you, or restrained you when you struggled. That was the attendant, and there were nowhere near enough of them. The attendant's job was not a respectable one, and it didn't attract respectable wages, so the people doing it were often those who couldn't find better work. They lived on the premises frequently, their own lives half swallowed by the institution. A good attendant could make a ward bearable, could learn the patients, could head off a crisis with a quiet word. A bad one could make it a place of small daily terrors. And the patient had almost no recourse. Complaining about an attendant meant complaining about the very people who controlled your food, your bath, your bed, your access to the airing court, and who could write in your casebook that you were agitated and difficult, which was exactly the word that justified whatever they'd done to you in the first place. The young law student at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum who described being thrashed with a walking stick wasn't describing official policy. He was describing what one attendant did to one patient on one morning in a system where that was very hard to prove and very easy to deny. Men and women were kept strictly apart. Class kept the paupers separate from the private patients. Wakefield had 12 wards for men and 14 for women, and the visitor I mentioned earlier put his finger on the central problem of running such a place. The difficulty, he said, came less from the sheer number of inmates than from the impossibility of sorting them properly. Too many people, too few categories, too little space to keep the recovering apart from the hopeless. So they bled together. The newly admitted woman, frightened and possibly recoverable, ended up in a day room with women who had been there 20 years and would die there, and the atmosphere of that room was set by the latter, not the former. That bleeding together was quietly one of the cruelest mechanics of the whole place, because moral treatment had depended on the opposite. The early theory said you sorted people carefully, kept the acute and the hopeful away from the chronic and the distressed, surrounded a recoverable patient with calm and order so they had something to recover toward. Crowding made that impossible. Once the wards were full and overflowing, you put people where there was space, not where they belonged, and the frightened new arrival learned what her future looked like by spending her days surrounded by it. A woman who might, in a small, calm setting, have steadied and gone home, instead spent her first weeks watching the long-term patients, the ones who rocked and wept and stared, absorbing the lesson that this was the place she now lived and these were the people she now was. The institution had a way of teaching you to be a patient, and the lesson was hard to unlearn. Which raises the question of what happened when someone on the ward became unmanageable. And here we arrive at the part of asylum life that did the most to earn these places their reputation: the restraints. The arsenal was extensive: the straight waistcoat, the straitjacket, the garment that crossed your arms across your body and buckled them behind your back so you couldn't move them, manacles, leg locks, muffs that enclosed the hands, leather straps to bind you to a bed or a chair, the restraint chair, sometimes called a coercion chair, that held you fixed and upright, the crib bed, a covered cot you couldn't climb out of, and in America, the device that became almost a symbol of the whole era, the Utica crib. Every one of these objects had a justification attached to it, and the justifications were almost always about the patient's own safety or the safety of others. The straitjacket stopped a person tearing at themselves or striking out. The muffs stopped them scratching their own skin raw. The strap kept them in the bed so they couldn't wander off and come to harm in the night. And sometimes the justification was even true. A person in the grip of genuine violent crisis can hurt themselves badly, and the people responsible for them faced a real problem. But the trouble with a cupboard full of restraints is the same trouble as a cupboard full of anything. Once it's there, it gets used, and it gets used for less and less. The strap meant for the rare violent crisis became the strap used on the merely disruptive, then on the merely inconvenient, then on the patient nobody had time for, because an attendant with 80 people to manage and a cupboard full of straps will, sooner or later, reach for the straps. The devices didn't stay reserved for the cases that justified them. They couldn't. The whole reform movement we're about to come to grew out of exactly that recognition that the existence of the restraint guaranteed its overuse. Alongside the hardware sat the water treatments, somewhere between medicine and punishment. Cold water was used in short, sharp bursts, 15 or 20 minutes at a time, the theory being that you could shock an excited or manic patient into calm, obedient stillness. Some patients were immersed until they were on the edge of unconsciousness. Warm baths were used as well, and the warm bath could become its own ordeal. A patient strapped under a covered bath with only their head sticking out, left there for hours, and in some cases for days. The line between treating someone and subduing someone was not always one the staff could see or wanted to. The cold water in particular gets described in the records in language that makes its real purpose plain. It was used to reduce a highly excitable or manic patient to a calm and obedient state. Calm and obedient. Those are not the words of medicine. They're the words of control. A frightened, agitated human being was held under a cold douche or plunged into a cold bath until the fight went out of them, and the staff recorded it as treatment because that's what the framework called it. The patient experiencing it didn't have a framework. They just had the cold, the held-down helplessness, and the understanding that this would happen again if they didn't go quiet. The straitjacket is the image everyone carries, and the reality of it was about helplessness more than pain. You were inside it for hours. You couldn't scratch an itch, couldn't wipe your own face, couldn't feed yourself, couldn't manage any of the small dignities of using a toilet. You were a parcel, and someone else decided when you'd be unwrapped. The restraint chair held you the same way, upright, fixed, sometimes for so long that the body suffered just from the immobility, and the indignity compounded itself. A person left bound and unable to relieve themselves was left to soil the restraint, and then the soiling became another mark against them, another reason in the casebook to call them degraded and unmanageable, another justification for the next round. The Utica crib deserves its own moment. Because of all the devices, it's the one that makes people recoil even now. It came from a French asylum in the 1840s and arrived at the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica in 1846. It was a box, a slatted wooden box about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 18 inches deep, with a hinged lid that locked. You were laid in it on your back. The lid came down, and there was barely 12 inches between your body and the slats above your face. You couldn't sit up. You couldn't turn over properly. You couldn't get out. Daniel Hackchuk, of the reforming Tuke family, said the thing inevitably suggested, when occupied, that you were looking at an animal in a cage. Patients spent nights in these boxes. Some patients died in them, occasionally from a heart attack or a stroke that staff mistook for ordinary agitation, the person struggling and crying out inside the box while the attendants assumed they were simply being difficult. It took until 1887 for the superintendent at Utica to clear every crib out of the building, reporting with evident relief that they'd finally managed to do without these restraint beds. 40 years of boxes. The crib spread through American asylums under superintendents who genuinely believed in it. Men like John Gray at Utica, who ran the place for decades and defended the device against critics. And there were critics, loud ones, doctors who looked at a person locked in a coffin-shaped box overnight and could not square it with the word treatment. When the cribs finally came out of Utica in January 1887, the superintendent who removed them, George Bloomer, wrote about being happy to report that they'd been able to dispense with them, the relief of a man who'd inherited the things and was glad to be rid of them. But think about the 40 years between the first one arriving and the last one leaving. 40 years of people put to bed in a locked box every night in an institution that called itself a hospital. The British, who had largely abandoned mechanical restraint, looked across the ocean at the American attachment to the crib with a certain horror, and the Americans looked back at British seclusion cells and saw the same thing. Both were sure the other had got it wrong. The person in the box, or the person in the locked cell, experienced it from the inside, where the philosophical argument didn't reach. Against all of this stood a reform movement that genuinely changed things, and it started in a small asylum in Lincoln. The Lincoln Asylum was a modest charitable institution, only about 100 patients, and in the 1830s its house surgeon, a young man named Robert Gardner Hill, backed by the physician Edward Parker Charlesworth, did something nobody quite believed was possible. He abolished mechanical restraint entirely. By 1838, the Lincoln Asylum used no straitjackets, no manacles, no chairs, nothing. Hill gave a lecture about it, and his claim was bold and total. In a properly built asylum, he said, with enough suitable attendants, restraint was never necessary, never justifiable, and always injurious in all cases of lunacy whatsoever. He framed himself as finishing the work the French reformer Philippe Pinel had begun decades earlier. Hill didn't get there overnight, and the records of how Lincoln did it are almost mundane in a way that makes the change more impressive, not less. They didn't have a miracle. They had attention. The institution had begun keeping careful track of every single instance of restraint, writing it down, counting it year by year, and once you start counting a thing, you start asking whether you really need it. The numbers fell. The straps came off one category of patient, then another, the staff watching nervously to see if disaster followed, and disaster didn't follow. Charlesworth had been pushing the place in that direction for years, reducing the irons step by step, and Hill took it the last distance to nothing at all. The whole thing rested on a quiet, almost bureaucratic insight, that restraint had become a habit nobody examined, and that when you actually examined it, case by case, you kept finding it wasn't doing what everyone assumed. A man who'd been strapped down for years turned out, when carefully watched instead, to be manageable. The cruelty had been a substitute for staffing and patience, and Lincoln proved you could pay in staffing and patience instead. The idea might have stayed a Lincoln curiosity if it hadn't reached the right man. John Connolly was the resident physician at Hanwell, the biggest asylum in the country, getting on for 1,000 patients. He visited Lincoln, saw it working, and brought non-restraint to Hanwell by September 1839. And because Hanwell was huge and prominent, when Hanwell did it, the whole country paid attention. Connolly wrote a book about it, toured the idea, defended it, and by the mid-1850s he could report that 24 English institutions holding more than 24,000 patients had nearly abandoned mechanical restraint. On paper, the chains were coming off everywhere. What Connolly did at Hanwell took real nerve, and it's worth saying so. He took the largest, most crowded asylum in England, full of the most difficult cases anyone could point to, and he stripped out the straitjackets and the manacles and the chairs in front of a profession half convinced he'd get someone killed. The standard objection was obvious. Without restraint, how do you stop a violent patient hurting themselves or others? Connolly's answer was that restraint had never really stopped that. It had just made it invisible, and that what actually kept a ward safe was enough trained attendants paying attention. The reform put the burden back on staffing and supervision, and that is exactly why it would later collapse, because staffing and supervision were the first things to break when the buildings filled. But for a while, at Hanwell, in front of everyone, it held. A man walked the wards of the country's biggest madhouse and showed that you could run it without irons. Robert Gardner Hill had proved it on a small scale at Lincoln. Connolly proved it at scale, where it counted, and the country could no longer pretend the chains were necessary. Here's the honest complication, though, the thing the triumphant version of the story leaves out. Non-restraint did not mean the end of coercion. It mostly meant a change of method. If you couldn't strap a struggling patient to a chair, you put them in seclusion instead, locked alone in a single room, sometimes a padded cell. Connolly himself became the great champion of seclusion, and critics at the time pointed out the obvious, that locking a person alone in a cell looked an awful lot like the solitary confinement of a prison. Force-feeding replaced the restraint of patients who wouldn't eat. The straitjacket gave way to the locked door and the padded wall. Better, in most ways, but not the clean break the reformers liked to describe. The cruelty didn't vanish. It found quieter forms. The padded cell, in particular, was its own small hell. A bare room, walls and floor lined with padding so you couldn't injure yourself against them, the door locked, a peephole for the attendant. Quiet, in the sense that nobody was holding you down. Also a place where a frightened person could be left alone with their fear for hours, with no clock, no company, no way to know when it would end. And the force-feeding of patients who refused food was its own violence dressed as care. A patient who wouldn't eat, whether from delusion or despair or a deliberate refusal, was held and fed through a tube, the food forced past their resistance. The staff called it saving the patient's life, and sometimes it was. But the experience of it from the inside was of being overpowered and invaded, and a person who had stopped eating because they no longer wanted to be alive learned, very fast, that even that last refusal was not theirs to make. And then the numbers betrayed everyone. Because the great reform of non-restraint depended entirely on Hill's condition, enough suitable attendants in a properly built asylum, and over the second half of the century that condition collapsed under sheer weight of bodies. This is the part of the story where the good intentions drown. Let me give you the numbers, because they're the engine of everything that follows. In 1844, the commissioners in lunacy counted just over 20,000 certified insane people in England and Wales, about 1 in every 800 people. By 1859, it was nearly 37,000. By 1868, just over 50,000, now 1 in every 432. By 1896, 96,000. And on the first day of 1902, the count reached 110,713 people, roughly 1 in every 300. The population of the country grew over those decades, but the asylum population grew far faster. The average asylum held about 115 patients in 1806. By 1900, the average held over 1,000. The early reformers had wanted asylums capped at around 300, small enough to know every patient. By the end of the century, the commissioners themselves were reporting that nearly half the county asylums were officially overcrowded. Now, a fair word about those figures, because they're often quoted loosely. The 110,000 counts everyone certified insane in every form of care, the asylums and the workhouses and the licensed houses, and the people kept singly, not just the bodies inside the great county buildings. So it's a count of the confined and the certified across the whole system, not a single building's role. But the shape of it holds however you slice it. Roughly 20,000 at the start of Victoria's reign, well over 100,000 by the time the Edwardians arrived. A 5-fold rise in the certified population over 6 decades, far outpacing the growth of the country itself. Whatever you want to say about why, more illness, or more diagnosis, or simply more willingness to use the institutions now that they existed. The buildings filled and filled and filled, and the system that had been designed for hundreds found itself holding tens of thousands. Watch what this did to the flagship buildings. Hanwell opened built for about 500 and held nearly 1,900 by 1888. Colney Hatch, that enormous building, opened in 1851, built for 1,250, was extended within a few years to hold 2,000 and by 1898 held around 2,500 people. And the records from Colney Hatch contain the sentence that captures the whole tragedy in plain language. As the population grew, the staff were unable to cope, and so, the account says, they had to resort to the straitjacket and other methods of restraint. The chains John Connolly had so proudly removed came back. Belief in non-restraint hadn't died. 2,000 people now filled a building meant for half that, with nowhere near the hands needed to manage them any other way. The reform didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because the buildings filled past the point where kindness was physically possible. Hold the two numbers side by side. Hanwell built for 500, holding 1,900. Colney Hatch built for 1,250, holding 2,500. Each of those buildings was carrying roughly double the human beings it had been designed for, in the same corridors, the same dormitories, the same dining halls, served by a staff that had not doubled to match. Every calculation that had made non-restraint possible at Hanwell in 1839 depended on a ratio of attendance to patients that simply no longer existed by the 1880s. Connolly's reform had a hidden condition written into it, enough suitable attendance, and when the patients doubled and the attendance didn't, the condition broke and the straps came back out of the cupboard. The people running Colney Hatch in the 1860s weren't villains who'd rejected the reform. They were administrators drowning in bodies, reaching for the only tool that let one exhausted attendant keep 80 patients from harm. And the tool was the thing the reformers had spent 20 years trying to abolish. The dream of the empty restraint cupboard died quietly, ward by overcrowded ward, killed off by arithmetic rather than by any argument anyone won. What had been built as a place of treatment became a place of storage. The acutely ill who might recover were now a thin layer floating on top of an enormous growing population of chronic, incurable, long-stay patients who simply accumulated year after year because they couldn't get better and there was nowhere else for them to go. The asylum filled faster than death could empty it. The commissioners in lunacy watched this happen and said so, in report after report, with a kind of weary precision. By the 1870s, they were noting that something like half the county asylums were officially over their proper numbers. The original vision, asylums of around 300 where the superintendent could plausibly know every patient and tailor the treatment, was simply gone, swallowed by buildings holding 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 and more. And once an asylum passed a certain size, the moral treatment that had justified the whole enterprise became physically impossible. You cannot coax 2,000 people gently back toward reason. You can only feed them, house them, keep them from killing themselves or each other, and wait. The cure had quietly turned into custody, and almost nobody had decided to make it happen. It happened by arithmetic, one admission at a time, faster than the discharges and the deaths could keep up. And the conditions of that crowding killed people directly. Pack 1,000, 2,000, 2,500 bodies into wards built for half that number, with poor ventilation and Victorian sanitation, and disease does the rest. Tuberculosis, called phthisis or consumption then, was the great killer inside asylum walls, spreading through the crowded dormitories where patients slept close together, breathing the same stale air. dysentery, typhoid, cholera when it came through, erysipelas, a vicious skin infection, pneumonia carrying off the weak in winter. The dormitories were the heart of the problem, beds crammed close, rows of them filling rooms never meant to hold so many, the air thick and shared, night after night. Tuberculosis loves exactly those conditions, close quarters and stale air and bodies already worn down, and it moved through the wards accordingly, the cough passing bed to bed. The Victorians had theories about ventilation, about miasma and bad air, and they built their asylums with great corridors and high windows partly to combat it. But a building designed to breathe for 500 cannot breathe for 2,000. Sanitation strained the same way. Privies and drains and water supplies sized for the original population had to serve 2 or 3 times the number, and when typhoid or dysentery got into a water supply in those conditions, it spread fast and it spread wide. A person committed for melancholia, who might in time have recovered, could instead catch consumption from the next bed and die of their lungs, the original reason for their being there almost beside the point by the end. The West Riding mortality records put hard figures on it. In 1 year, around 1900, of 152 deaths, 67 were from brain and spinal disease, 18 from consumption, 8 from pneumonia, a death rate of more than 10% of the average number of residents. In another year, the same asylum recorded 228 deaths, over 12.5% of its residents, 74 from brain and spinal disease, 49 from consumption, 20 from pneumonia, plus the typhoid and the colitis. More than 1 in 8 patients dying in a single year, in a place that had been built to make people well. Sit with that rate for a moment because it's easy to let a percentage slide past. More than 1 in 8, in a building of say 2,000 people, that's 250 deaths in a year, a death every working day and several at the weekend, the dead house never empty for long, the burial register filling steadily, the graves in the field behind the wall going in one after another. And these weren't, for the most part, people who'd come in dying. Many had come in for melancholia or mania or some condition of the mind, expecting at worst a long confinement, and had then been killed by the place itself, by the consumption in the dormitory, or the typhoid in the water, or the simple grinding decline of a body kept too long in too crowded a building. The asylum had a way of converting a mental illness into a death sentence through no single act of cruelty at all, just the steady background fact of what it was like to live packed in among the sick. A good portion of those brain and spinal deaths were a single grim diagnosis, general paralysis of the insane, GPY, which we now know was the final stage of syphilis reaching the brain, sometimes decades after the original infection. It struck mostly men in their 30s and 40s. It announced itself with grand delusions, a man suddenly convinced he was enormously rich or powerful, his speech going slurred and tremulous, his walk unsteady, his pupils uneven. By the late part of the century, up to 1 in 5 men admitted to British asylums was diagnosed with it, and the prognosis was a flat line. As one historian put it bluntly, the prognosis for all those admitted was death. They came in deluded and grandiose. and they died, usually within 1 to 5 years, the brain disease running its full course inside the walls. The Scottish superintendent T.S. Clouston called it the most terrible of all brain diseases. No treatment existed, only the slide. The cruelty of GPY was partly in how it looked at the start. A man in its early grip could seem almost enviable, full of plans, convinced of his own wealth and brilliance and importance, expansive and cheerful in a way that didn't match his shabby circumstances. Then the body began to fail in step with the mind. The speech thickened, the hands shook, the walk became a stagger. The grand schemes dissolved into confusion, and the confusion into a kind of vacancy, and the vacancy into death. The doctors could chart the whole descent because they saw it so many times, the same arc in man after man after man, and there was nothing any of them could do but write it down. The connection to syphilis was being argued over through these years, and not everyone accepted it, but the men dying of it didn't need the argument settled. They simply progressed on schedule toward the dead house. Suicide took its share, and so did the slower death of simply being forgotten in a back ward for 30 or 40 years, growing old in an institution, family visits thinning to nothing, until one winter the pneumonia or the consumption finally took you. And all of this pessimism had an intellectual frame by the end of the century, supplied by men like Henry Maudsley, the most prominent psychiatrist of the late Victorian age, who became Britain's leading voice for degeneration theory, the idea that insanity was inherited cerebral decay, a bad bloodline running down through the generations toward idiocy and extinction. It was a profoundly fatalistic idea, and it gave the warehouse a justification. If the mad were degenerate stock doomed to decline anyway, why pour money and effort into curing them? Better to just contain them. A contemporary dismissed Maudsley's later writings as a hymn for pessimism, and that's exactly what the asylums had become by 1900. Vast, crowded hymns for pessimism, holding 100,000 people that medicine had largely given up on. The shift in mood across the century is one of the saddest parts of the whole story. The men who built the early asylums, the Tukes and the Connollys and the Ellises, genuinely believed they were in the cure business, that madness was a condition people recovered from given the right surroundings, and that the asylum was a hospital in the truest sense, a place you came to get well and then left. The men running the asylums by the end of the century had mostly stopped believing that. They'd watched the buildings fill with chronic cases who never left. They'd absorbed the new theories about heredity and decay, and they'd quietly reframed their own work from healing to housing. The asylum hadn't changed its name or its architecture. It had changed its purpose, and the change had happened inside the heads of the people running it. A loss of hope that the patients had no way to see but every reason to feel. You could be admitted in 1850 to a place that expected to send you home, and you could die in 1895 in the same institution, which by then expected nothing of the kind for anyone like you. And recovery, when it came, was its own complicated thing. People did get better and go home. The records show discharges, patients marked recovered or relieved and released back to their families and their lives. But the chances were not even, and they got worse as the century went on and the buildings filled. An acutely ill patient admitted early, treated reasonably, with a family still willing to take them back, had a real chance of walking out. A pauper with no one to receive them, sunk into chronic illness, swept into an overcrowded ward where the staff could barely manage the basics, had almost none. And there was a cruel feedback in it. The longer you stayed, the more institutionalized you became, the harder it grew to imagine you coping outside, the easier it became for everyone to agree you'd better stay. The door that had been so easy to come through grew harder and harder to find from the inside, until for a great many people it simply wasn't there anymore. The fire at Colney Hatch shows you the human cost of how they'd chosen to house the overflow. By the 1890s, the asylum was so crowded that extra accommodation was thrown up cheaply, and in 1896 a set of temporary annexes went up, built of timber and corrugated iron. In the early hours of the 27th of January, 1903, one of these annexes, housing 320 of the most chronic and infirm women, caught fire. 52 women died. 52. Many of them were the frailest patients in the whole institution, the ones least able to move quickly, trapped in a cheap wooden shed that had been built because the proper buildings were already full. It remains one of the worst peacetime fires in London's history, and it happened because warehousing human beings is dangerous in ways that go well beyond the slow deaths of disease. The detail that makes it worse is the helplessness of the victims. These were the chronic, infirm women, the long-stay cases, many of them old, many of them physically frail or confused, exactly the people who could not run, could not understand quickly what was happening, could not save themselves in the dark and the smoke. The temporary block went up fast, timber and corrugated iron burning the way timber and corrugated iron burns, and there simply wasn't time. 52 women who had already lost their freedom, their names reduced to numbers, their lives spent in a back ward, died in a building that existed only because the institution had run out of room for them anywhere better. Nobody had set out to kill them. They died of the same thing that shaped so much of asylum life by then, of there being too many people and not enough of anything else. When you died inside, whatever took you, the question became what happened to your body, and the answer is the quietest horror in the whole story, because it's the one nobody thought about. They just did it. If you were a pauper and you died in the asylum and nobody claimed your body, you were buried in the asylum's own burial ground, in a grave that was very often unmarked, or marked only with a number, or shared with several other bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep. No headstone with your name, a small iron marker, a number keyed to an entry in the death register, the number again, following you right to the end, the same impulse that gave you a number on admission day, giving you 1 in the ground. Across the country, researchers estimate that hundreds of thousands of people lie nameless in unmarked graves at something like 140 former asylum sites. A whole buried population, anonymous. Think about what an unmarked grave actually means, beyond the absence of a stone. It means that the most basic record of a human life, here lies this person, who was born and lived and died, has been deliberately withheld. A headstone is a small claim that someone mattered enough to be remembered by name. The numbered grave makes the opposite claim. It says this person was a cost to be disposed of efficiently in the cheapest decent manner, and that nobody was expected to come looking. Often nobody did. Families that had handed over a relative years before, who had stopped visiting, who had perhaps told the neighbors a more comfortable story about where that person had gone, did not always come for the body. And an unclaimed body, in the legal language of the time, was available for other purposes. And for a good number of those bodies, burial wasn't even the immediate fate, because of a law passed in 1832, the Anatomy Act. The Act allowed anatomists and medical schools to dissect unclaimed bodies, and unclaimed in practice meant the bodies of people who died in workhouses, hospitals, prisons, and asylums, if no relative claimed and paid to bury them within a set window. Poor law authorities and asylums could actually recover some of the cost of a person's care by selling their corpse to an anatomy school. When the act was debated, a member of Parliament named Henry Hunt put the objection as plainly as anyone ever has. "They tell us it was necessary for science," he said. Science? Why, who is science for? Not for poor people. The poor would supply the bodies. The rich would supply the students. The act had been passed for a reason that made grim sense at the time. Medical schools needed bodies to teach anatomy, and before 1832 the only legal supply was the corpses of executed murderers, which was nowhere near enough. The shortfall had created the body snatchers, the resurrection men who dug up fresh graves to sell, and worse, the murderers who'd realized it was easier to make a fresh corpse than to dig one up. The Anatomy Act was supposed to end all that by providing a legal supply, and the legal supply it chose was the poor, the unclaimed dead of the institutions, including the asylums, would feed the dissecting tables. It solved a real problem by deciding, quite explicitly, that a poor person's body belonged to the state in a way a rich person's never would. Henry Hunt saw it coming and said it out loud. The body that escaped the body snatcher only to be handed over by the workhouse to the anatomist had not really escaped anything. The documented cases are precise and chilling. The Great Yarmouth Workhouse Union sent 26 bodies to the anatomy school at Cambridge between 1880 and 1901. One of them was a pauper named Frank Hyde, who died in April 1901. The records said he was buried by friends. He wasn't. He was sent to Cambridge, dissected, and only 11 months after his death finally put into the ground, in an unmarked pauper grave that already held 6 other bodies. The discrepancy in his case caused enough fuss to trigger a public inquiry. At Sheffield, 56 burials between 1869 and 1880 list the deceased's last residence as the Sheffield Union Medical School, each with a gap of 4 to 6 weeks between the date of death and the date of burial, the gap that proves the body had been dissected before being buried. In one Sheffield case, a widow who came to identify her husband was shown the wrong corpse entirely, one that had already been shaved for the anatomy table. Frank Hyde's 11 months are worth holding on to. A man dies in April. His body does not go into the ground in April or May or June. It goes to Cambridge, where students learn anatomy on it through the long middle of the year, and only the following spring, 11 months later, is what's left of him finally buried, laid into a grave that already holds 6 other people, with no stone and no name. The record said his friends had buried him, The record was a lie covering a transaction, and the Sheffield widow, shown a stranger's shaved corpse when she came looking for her husband, captures the whole indignity in one scene. She came to do the last human thing you can do for someone, to identify them, to claim them, to see them properly into the ground, and the institution couldn't even produce the right body, because the right body had already gone to the table and the paperwork hadn't kept up. The poor didn't only lose their liberty and often their lives to these institutions. A great many of them lost the final ownership of their own remains. Inside the asylums themselves, post-mortems became routine in rooms called dead houses. The Royal Edinburgh Asylum's dead house has been studied closely, and the description of what happened there is stark, that deceased pauper patients were turned into mere pathological specimens. Only about 1 in 10 pauper deaths there was formally dissected, but the dead house moved over the century from a marginal corner of the asylum to a central part of medical research. The body that had been a person, then a patient, then a number, became at the very end a specimen on a table, and then a number in the ground. The logic behind the dead house was, in fairness, partly scientific curiosity of a kind we'd recognize. Doctors wanted to understand what had gone wrong inside the heads of the people who died in their care, and the only way to look was to open them up. The study of GP1, the work that eventually tied it to syphilis, depended on exactly this kind of post-mortem examination. So the dead house was, in one sense, where Victorian psychiatry slowly learned things that mattered. But the people on the tables had not consented and could not, and the bodies that ended up there were, overwhelmingly, the bodies of the poor, because the families of the wealthy claimed their dead and buried them whole. The same class line that ran through every other part of the asylum ran straight through the dead house door. The rich died and were mourned and buried. The poor died and were examined, recorded and filed into the numbered ground, their final usefulness to the institution being the lesson their opened bodies could teach. The burial grounds themselves are real places you can stand in today. At High Royds, the old West Riding Asylum at Menston, the burial ground at Buckle Lane was consecrated in 1893, and between 1890 and 1969, some 2,861 people were buried there, almost all of them in unmarked numbered graves. At the Mendip Hospital Cemetery near Wells, in use from 1874 to 1963, nearly 3,000 patients and staff lie buried, most of the graves marked only with a small iron key bearing a number. At Cheddleton in Staffordshire, a single memorial stone records 1,389 patients buried between 1903 and 1972 in over 1,300 unmarked graves. At Exminster, the old Devon County Asylum, the cemetery was in use for over a century. The graves unmarked, the numbers recorded only in the asylum's own registers, and for the years 1900 to 1915 alone, the records show 1,024 burials, more than one person a week, every week, for 15 years. During a flu epidemic in 1963, 17 patients were buried there in a single week. The iron keys at Mendip are the detail I keep turning over. A small numbered iron marker stood in for a headstone, the same kind of object you might use to label a row in a garden or a stall in a stable. The number stood where a cross or a name should have been. Nearly 3,000 of them in rows, each one standing for a person whose name lived only in a register kept somewhere else. And ex-minsters one a week, year on year, for 15 years and well beyond, gives you the sheer steady volume of it. These weren't dramatic mass deaths. They were the ordinary, relentless output of large institutions full of the sick and the old and the forgotten. A body to bury most weeks, sometimes several, the numbered markers going into the field in a quiet procession that ran for decades. The 17 in a single week during the 1963 flu only stands out because it broke the rhythm. The rhythm itself, 1 or 2 a week for a century, was the real story, and it ran almost entirely unwatched. Some of these places nearly disappeared completely. The Horton Cemetery, part of the great cluster of asylums at Epsom in Surrey, holds something like 9,000 unmarked graves, and in the 1980s it was simply sold to a private landowner. The dead along with the land, and it sits inaccessible behind a fence. 9,000 people you cannot visit. 9,000. A small town's worth of the dead, sold off as a parcel of land, fenced and closed. People with descendants still alive, people whose great-grandchildren might want to come and stand somewhere near them, and the somewhere is locked behind a private boundary because at some point the cemetery stopped being treated as a cemetery and started being treated as real estate. A group has formed to try to do something about it. The Friends of Horton Cemetery, working to record who's there and to push for access and recognition. But the basic fact sits there as a kind of final insult on top of all the others. These people lost their freedom to the asylum, many lost their lives to it, most lost their names to the numbered grave, and then a good number of them lost even the grave itself, the patch of ground, sold out from under them a century after they were buried in it. But the High Royds burial ground at Buckle Lane went the other way. It had fallen derelict, overgrown, the markers lost, the 2,861 people effectively erased a second time by neglect. In 2008, a group of local people launched a campaign, the Friends of High Royds Memorial Garden, and over the next couple of years, they cleared it, restored it, and turned it into a memorial garden, finished in 2010, with a permanent record of all those buried kept in the restored Asylum Chapel. The names that the system had reduced to numbers on iron markers were gathered up and written down again and put somewhere a person could come and read them. There's a similar story at Mendip, where the Friends of the Mendip Hospital Cemetery formed around the year 2000 and saved the place from being auctioned off. And at Cheddleton, where the unmarked field became a lawned memorial. People going back, generations later, to the fields behind the walls, and doing the one thing the asylum never did, giving the number back its name. The work of those friends groups is slow and unglamorous and mostly done by volunteers, people who spend their weekends matching grave numbers to register entries, transcribing the old death books, clearing brambles off ground nobody had tended in decades. They are, in a sense, completing a piece of paperwork the institutions never finished, the simple act of saying who is here. At High Royds, 2,861 names that had been allowed to fade back into the numbers were carried into the restored chapel and set down where the living could find them. A person standing in that garden now can do what no one was meant to be able to do. They can find a particular human being in that ground by name and know that they were here and that they mattered enough for someone, finally, to write it down. All right, that's us done. I always sit a little quieter after one like this, so thanks for staying with it. If you got something out of the video, the most useful thing you can do is just hit subscribe. It's a small thing on your end, and it's most of the battle on mine for getting the next one seen. I also keep a Patreon where everything goes up early and stays free of ads for good, and that's what actually buys the research time these need. Support it, lurk, or just leave a comment with the name on a grave somewhere near you that nobody talks about anymore. Any of it means a lot. Take care of yourself, and I'll be back soon with another